that leads us very nicely, actually, to the next area that I was interested in. The United States and China, as individual countries, have been seriously criticised for their level of emissions. And in your recent research, you've also highlighted how the European Union is not as green as it might initially appear. So what responsibilities and how are they positioning themselves for the negotiations and for the preparation for their national responsibilities? There's some key developments like the US-China agreement and China's declarations that you've written about.
And so as part of this, as you said, the intended nationally determined contribution, what we've seen is by getting away from this view of international negotiations are about imposing commitments on people and asking countries to take national responsibility almost for their own commitments, has led to a real kind of impetus and sense of positivity about the Paris Agreement. Now the problem is that when you add together all the national agreements that are on the table, we're still going to end up with catastrophic climate change, which is something that your students are going to have to worry about more than myself and yourself. So when you trade off inclusivity, you sometimes lose ambition. So there is a trade-off there, but let's look on the positive side. So what we've seen is that the US and China, almost out of the blue in September, October 2014, agreed to this US-China pact, where China agreed that it would peak its emissions by 2030 for the first time. So that was the first time that China ever agreed to sort of a cap on its emissions, although it's unclear at this point what that cap will be, other than they've said that at this point they're willing to commit that they will, their emissions will cease to increase by 2030. The US then agreed that it would reduce its emissions 26 to 28% by 2025 on a 2005 baseline. So all of these baselines and years, it's very confusing. They change a lot and everybody does their commitment in their own language in the way that suits themselves, and there's a lot of problems around that. But ultimately, this was a really kind of groundbreaking and remarkable commitment, and changes the trajectory, the development trajectory for both countries. And it was the first time that we really saw China and the US coming together with something very, very substantial at international negotiations. And the EU's own commitment is to reduce emissions 40% on 1990 levels by 2030. So again, different base years and everything. And so we have the three sort of biggest players at international negotiations have all come forward with relatively ambitious proposals. And so this approach to international negotiations means that what the US is looking for is that it knows that domestically it can't get a legally binding international treaty through its domestic, particularly all international treaties need to be ratified by the US Senate. So this agreement will have some form of legal character, but it won't be a legally binding top-down treaty, and it'll be the lawyers who effectively decide what the legal standing of the treaty is. But effectively what we'll find is some form of treaty that doesn't need to be ratified by the US Senate, so it doesn't have the character maybe of a full international legally binding treaty. Maybe it builds on existing treaties in some form, and some form of aggregation of all these individual pledges which are coming forward. And it's not just the EU and the US, but Japan has to bring forward its pledge, and all parties, be they developed or developing, have to bring forward some sort of pledge. And I think that that's also sort of a change from the Kyoto division between developed and developing countries, that all countries have to bring forward a pledge. It mightn't be a very ambitious pledge in the case of a very poor developing country. Of course, you wouldn't expect a very poor developing country to have any sort of emissions reduction pledge, but they would still bring forward some sort of announcement of what they're willing to do or what they're willing to contribute to the international negotiation process.